Hello. Hi. Let me just check my mute. Hello. Hi. Okay. So today I'm going through the Pasir Secondary School Sec 4 Express Biology paper. I'll be going through paper 1 and paper 2, and hopefully you can understand my explanations. So before I go through, there are 3 types of questions in any biology paper. There is recall, application, and inference questions. Recall is pure information that you just learned in your textbook. Applications is information that you might learn through your textbook, but they will test it in a new scenario. And inference questions are usually a follow-up from application questions, and usually they start off with suggest why or suggest how. So in the arrow here, it does show least to most challenging. So actually recall questions are the least challenging out of the 3 types of questions, and inference are usually the most challenging types of questions. However, tips to increase your scores and increase your marks. So recall with pure memory, and if you study hard enough and you recall more through table charts, associations, and acronyms, it will help you retain your information better. For application questions, the more practice papers that you do, the more types of questions that you will be exposed to. So in exams, you might see a certain kind of trend in application questions for certain topics. For inference questions, you should know your information well in the application question, and thus in inference, it's usually a lot of common sense, and down the road in further questions, I will show you examples of them. So let's start. Question 1, the diagram shows a typical animal cell. Which structure synthesizes and transports lipids? So this is a pure recall question. It's identifying and the name and the function of your cell organelles. So the answer would be C, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, because the rest do not fit the organelle function. So mitochondrion actually produces energy for activities and is involved in cellular respiration. Lysosome contains the digestive enzymes, and RER contains ribosomes and transports proteins. So by process of elimination, even if you don't remember the function, the answer will be C. Question 2. A student who cuts out 4 cylinders of potato from the same potato. Each cylinder is 30 mm long, and the cylinders are all of the same diameter. The potato cylinders are placed in sugar solutions of different concentrations. After 1 hour, the lengths of the cylinders are measured again, and which potato cylinder has been placed in a solution with the water potential closest to that of the potato cells. So this is an application question of transports across membranes, and based on putting them in sugar solutions, this is an osmosis question. So you do note that there is sugar solutions of different concentrations, but we need to find a solution with the water potential closest to that of the potato cell. If you do recall your information from osmosis, in the solutions of higher and lower water potential, the cell becomes turgid or becomes plasmolysed. So the fact that they become turgid means that they expand in diameter, and when they become plasmolysed means that they shrink in diameter. So when you do look at these options, a solution with water potential closest to that of the potato cells would decrease or change the least out of the 4. So the answer is B. Let me just change this. The answer is B. Let's move on. Question 3. Which row defines active transport? So this is pure recall definitions, and active transport is the active process where energy is required. It involves the movement of substances across a partially permeable membrane against a concentration gradient. The answer is pretty obvious. It's definitely D. Let's move on. Question 4. Which chemical elements are present in both fats and proteins? Pure recall question. Just remember, if you have difficulty remembering this, recall your testing table. So the Buret's test, the proteins test, things like that. And if you can recall and you note this down, the chemical elements that are present in both proteins would be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Question 5. A sample of milk is tested with Benedict solution. After boiling, a yellow precipitate is observed. Which conclusion is correct? So option A and B are wrong because they do not fit the yellow precipitate. And it's impossible that no reducing sugars are present, because if they are not present, the solution will remain blue. So the only answer is D, which is reducing sugars are present. Question 6. Which of the following tests shows the presence of an enzyme in a biological washing powder? So if you don't really know what washing powder is, just remember your tests, your biological tests, and remember that in the burette test, to 2 cm cube of liquid sample, add this and shake well. So if you remember that, you'll be able to kind of infer that the answer is B, if it shakes well. The rest will be just stirring and there's no shaking, except for in the burette test. Question 7. Which of the following blood vessels transports blood with the highest glucose concentration? So this is homeostasis or transport in humans. And you remember that after a large meal, the hepatic vein would transport glucose-rich blood from the small intestines to the liver. So the blood leaves the liver and returns to the heart through the hepatic vein. So glucose-rich blood will be here, and the answer is C, hepatic portal vein. Let me just review that for you. It'll be C. Question 8. What describes the upper cuticle of a leaf? So pure recall question. It is a single layer of cells containing few or no chloroplasts, and the main function is that it prevents water loss. And the main function should be in your definition here, so the answer will be D. Question 9. 2 test tubes. Okay, this is an application question. 2 test tubes E and F were set up, each containing a solution of red hydrogen carbonate indicator. So this hydrogen carbonate indicator remains red when the CO2 concentration remains unchanged. It turns yellow when CO2 concentration increases and turns purple when CO2 decreases. So they give you this information here, and of course, this information will be important when you look at the question later. So similar tubes of the same aquatic plant were placed in tubes E and F. Tube E was uncovered while tube F had a black light-proof cover. So this already shows that the difference is the lack of light in the conditions. The tubes were left in a warm room in sunlight for 4 hours. So all variables are the same except for the lack of light in tube F. And what would be the color for hydrogen carbonate indicator in the tubes after 4 hours? So when you see lack of light, the automatic response would be what can the plant do with a lack of light? So without light, it's not able to go through the process of photosynthesis, and it's only able to do respiration. Whereas tube E would be able to have higher levels of oxygen, and it would be able to photosynthesize and produce oxygen, hence lowering the concentration of CO2. The answer is B. Because when CO2 concentration decreases, O2 increases due to the process of photosynthesis, hence E turns purple, but F only turns yellow when carbon dioxide concentration increases, which is respiration. Question 10. The graph shows the rates of photosynthesis at a plant in increasing light intensities at 2 different carbon dioxide concentrations. The temperature is kept constant. So when you see this, what may be limiting the rate of photosynthesis at P, Q, and R? So actually a lot of students get very confused by factors of limitation of the rate of photosynthesis. So another way to look at this question would be, what would be limiting a potential further increase? So aka if we had this factor, the rate of photosynthesis would be greater than what it is now. And actually, as you can see in P, it is increasing at a steady rate. So there is only further light intensity that can change its rate of photosynthesis. So if it had more light, it will have a greater rate of photosynthesis. Hence, A and B are out. However, in Q and R, even if you see that there's different levels of carbon dioxide, you can see that with these levels of carbon dioxide, the rate of photosynthesis is constant. So the limiting factor is the same. So if you do process of elimination, the same factor, carbon dioxide, the answer would be C. Let's move on. Question 11. The cut shoot of a plant is placed in a beaker containing a solution of blue dye for an hour, as shown. This is pretty much an application/recall question. The stem of the root, the shoot is then cut through an S and examined under a microscope. So when you see the cross section of a stem, you should be able to identify the components of the stem and at which region is the blue dye most concentrated. The answer should be that the blue dye is most concentrated where water is being taken up because it shows the blue dye. And the answer for that would be D. During translocation in plants, which substance is moved to and in which direction? This is pure recall question. If you remember translocation, it is the transport of manufactured food substances like sucrose and amino acids in plants from source to sink. So if you can see, water is completely out already. It's just purely sucrose. Anthers and stigmas are not used for transport or translocation in plants. It's more for reproduction. So the answer would be B. Question 13. The diagram shows plant in flask of water. It is left in the light at 16 degrees for 6 hours. So if you can see this diagram, cotton wool and layer of oil is stuffed in so that there is no loss of water through evaporation. And what explains the change in mass after 6 hours? As you can see, the mass decreases after 6 hours. So a lot of you might put like option A, absorption of water into the root hairs, because at first glance, because the water is absorbed through the roots, that's why the mass may decrease. But actually, it is option D. So it's transpiration from the leaves of the plant. Because transpiration is the loss of water vapor from aerial parts, especially through the stomata of the leaves. So there's no way for water to escape except for the leaves. And even if the plant were to take up water, it would still remain the same mass because it is unable to release the water from the aerial parts of the leaves. So option is D. Question 14. An oxygen molecule diffuses directly from the air in an ovulus to hemoglobin in a red blood cell. What is the minimum number of cell surface membranes through which this molecule must pass? So if you actually recall, this probably requires you to write out the process in general for you to remember what cell surface membranes that it must pass through. So oxygen in the air diffuses through in the thin film of moisture, alveolar wall, then wall surrounding the blood capillary, and then plasma into the red blood cell, and it combines with the hemoglobin in red blood cell, forming oxyhemoglobin. The answer is, pardon me, the answer is D. This really requires you to write out the full process, so please do make sure that you know your information well. A lot of these questions are actually recall/application questions. So in order to get a bulk of the marks, you really do need to remember your information well. Question 15. Which set of values best represents the blood capillaries in an artery, a network of capillaries, and a vein? So this is recall/application. It requires you to remember what functions each of them do and what happens to the blood pressure when blood flows through. So blood actually flows from the arteries to the capillaries to the veins. And the blood pressure in the arteries is actually much higher than in the veins because the artery mainly receives blood from the heart after contraction. And the arteries are thickened compared to veins, the walls of the artery, with smoother muscle fibers and elastic tissue. Hence, the artery will be it will be the highest amongst the three, so A and B are out. And between the capillary network and the vein is just responsible for processing the blood. It just carries the blood. It doesn't really do anything that increases or decreases pressure. So the option would be T. Let's move on. Question 16, pure recall question. How does tissue fluid differ from blood plasma? Just remember the differences between the two and remember the components of proteins, food, oxygen, and white blood cells in both, and you should be able to deduce that it's A. Question 17. This is might be a tough question for some people. The graph shows changes in the blood pressure in the left ventricle of the heart, during which period is the left atrium contracting. So, application recall. As the atrium contracts, when you remember during atrium contraction, the pressure within the atrial chamber would increase. So when they increase, it will force more blood flow across the valves. It will lead to a rapid flow of blood back into the ventricles. Then the blood does not flow back into the vena cava because of inertial effects of this return, and because the wave of contraction through the atrium moves, and this has a milking effect. Some components of this is out of your syllabus, but it's good to know, having a milking effect. So it does not have a rapid increase and decrease in pressure, and so the option will be in. Question 18. The diagram illustrates changes in blood pressure taking place inside the lungs during a complete cycle of breathing. Which position on the graph corresponds to the point at which the ribs are beginning to be raised? So, if you remember, when the ribs are beginning to be raised, through common sense, you already know that you're about to breathe in. When you touch your ribs and you breathe in, you will notice that the ribs are raised and expanded. This is because when you breathe in, the lung volume expands as a result of contraction of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. Thus, this expands the thoracic cavity, and due to this increase in volume, the pressure is decreased based on the principles of Boyle's law. So when you breathe in, the pressure in your lungs will decrease as the lungs begin to get bigger. The answer, pretty much straightforward already. You can see that it's C. Question 19. The diagram shows 3 types of cells. Oh, this is pure recognition and recall. And the cells, which cells are found in alveoli and bronchi? And the answer would definitely be A. Question 20. What are the effects of following activities or pulse rate when compared to resting pulse rate? When compared to resting pulse rate, you must know that any activity that is slightly more intensive than when you are resting. So any activity compared to resting pulse rate will increase your pulse rate in general. So no matter whether it's slow walking or fast running, your pulse rate would increase, and thus the answer is D. Question 21. A person drinks a large amount of water. How does this affect the water potentials of the liquids in the renal arteries, veins, and the ureters? So if you remember, renal veins actually carry filtered blood from the kidneys to the posterior vena cava, and the renal arteries carry unfiltered blood from the aorta to the kidneys. So filtered blood actually does not really contain water, does not contain much more or much less water. So there's little change in the water potential in the renal veins. However, in renal arteries, as the blood is unfiltered, when you drink a large amount of water, the water potential would be higher. And common sense, water potential in ureters, when you drink water, they would definitely be higher. So the answer is B. Let's move on. Question 22. The diagram shows a person